People often assume that after decades sitting behind a judge's bench, nothing surprises you anymore. They imagine the job turns every story into just another file, another number, another ruling written neatly into the record. But the truth is very different. Even after all these years, there are mornings when something happens in that courtroom that stays with me long after the lights are off and the doors are locked. There are moments that make me think about everything I was taught growing up, about fairness, about dignity, and about the quiet strength people carry when the world pushes them down. One particular morning still sits in my mind like it happened yesterday. Before I tell you what unfolded that day, let me ask you something simple. If you believe that justice should treat everyone the same, rich or poor, powerful or forgotten, then take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I read those comments more often than you might think, and they remind me that these stories travel much farther than the walls of my courtroom. That morning began the way most of my mornings do. I arrived at the courthouse just before 8:30, the way I have for most of my career. The city was still shaking off the last traces of night. A cool wind moved through the streets, carrying that familiar scent of wet pavement and early coffee drifting from the cafe across the corner. The courthouse itself always wakes slowly. The old wooden doors creak open, the lights flicker on one hallway at a time, and the quiet echoes of footsteps start filling the building. After all these years, that rhythm feels almost like breathing. My clerk, Emily, was already at her desk when I stepped inside. Emily has worked with me long enough that she knows my habits better than I do. She greeted me with a small smile and slid a steaming cup of coffee across the desk before I even asked. Strong. Black. Exactly the way I've taken it for nearly 3 decades. There's something comforting about that cup of coffee in the morning. It gives me a few minutes to sit quietly before the courtroom fills with the complicated stories people carry inside those case files. My father used to say something that stuck with me long before I ever wore this robe. He would say, "Son, the law isn't just words in a book, it's the weight of people's lives. If you ever forget that, you shouldn't be sitting in that chair." I think about that advice more often than people realize, especially on mornings when the files begin stacking up on my desk. Emily placed the day's docket in front of me, and I flipped through the folders the way I always do. Some were thick, filled with paperwork and arguments that would stretch into long hearings. Others were thin, just a citation or a small dispute waiting to be resolved. I've learned over the years that thin folders can hide very heavy stories. The courtroom opened a little after 9. People began filtering into the gallery, some nervous, some annoyed, some quietly hopeful that the day would go better than they feared. Police officers stood along the wall, lawyers shuffled through their notes, and the low murmur of voices bounced softly off the wooden benches. When I took my seat behind the bench, the room settled into that familiar silence that always comes before the first case is called. Emily read the first name from the list. The early cases that morning were the usual kind: traffic tickets, minor disputes, the small everyday problems that bring people into a courtroom. A broken tail light, an expired meter, a parking mistake made in a hurry. I listened carefully to each person who stepped forward. Some needed a warning, some needed a fine, some simply needed someone to hear them out. That's part of the job people rarely talk about. A courtroom isn't just a place for punishment. Sometimes it's the only place someone feels truly heard. As the morning moved along, I took another sip of coffee and glanced down at the next file waiting on the stack. It was unusually thin, just a few pieces of paper clipped together. Something about it caught my attention for reasons I couldn't explain at the time. Maybe it was instinct, or maybe it was the quiet voice in the back of my mind reminding me of my father's words. Either way, I placed that folder on top of the pile and told Emily we would call that case next. I had no idea that the man about to walk through those courtroom doors would remind everyone in that room, including me, what true dignity looks like when a person has almost nothing left. Emily called the next name from the docket, her voice steady as always. The courtroom doors opened slowly, and an older man stepped inside. Sometimes you can tell a lot about someone before they even reach the podium. The way they walk, the way they carry their shoulders, the way their eyes move around the room. This man walked carefully, like every step asked something from his body. His jacket was an old army green coat, the kind that had seen many winters. I noticed faint outlines on the shoulders where patches had once been sewn. His boots were worn and scuffed, the leather creased from years of use. But what stood out most wasn't the clothing. It was the quiet determination in the way he held himself upright. Even with a slight limp, he kept his back straight. Emily read the name from the file. Daniel Mercer. The man nodded politely and stepped up to the podium. His hands rested on the wooden edge, as if he needed the support. I looked at his eyes. After so many years in this courtroom, I've learned that eyes tell the truth long before words do. Some people stand there angry, some are defensive, some are trying very hard to hide something. Mr. Mercer's eyes looked tired. Not the kind of tired that comes from a long day at work. The kind that comes from a long fight. I greeted him the same way I greet everyone. "Good morning, sir. How are you today?" His voice came out rough but respectful. "I'm managing, Your Honor." That answer told me more than most people realize. I glanced down at the thin file in front of me. 5 citations. All parking violations, each one issued between 2 and 4 in the morning over the past several weeks, all in the same location, a small commercial parking lot on the edge of the city. The fines had already begun stacking up with late fees, turning what might have been a small mistake into something much heavier. I looked back at him. "Mr. Mercer, can you explain why your vehicle keeps appearing in this same lot in the middle of the night?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he slowly reached into the pockets of his coat. For a moment, the entire courtroom watched quietly. Then he turned both pockets inside out. A small car key slipped out and tapped softly against the wood of the podium. A folded receipt followed. That was all. No wallet, no bills, no coins, just empty cloth hanging from both sides of his coat. The silence in the courtroom deepened. Even after all these years, certain moments have a way of stopping the air in a room. I leaned forward slightly. "Sir, where do you currently live?" His jaw tightened, and he swallowed before answering. "I sleep wherever my car is parked, Your Honor." There was no drama in the way he said it, just a quiet statement of fact. "I lost my apartment earlier this year." A few people in the gallery shifted in their seats. I could hear someone whisper softly behind the second row. I kept my voice steady. "And that lot you've been parking in? Why there?" He looked down at the podium for a moment before answering. "There's a street light in the corner of it," he said. "Bright enough that you can see anyone walking up to the car." He paused, then added quietly, "Feels a little safer that way." I felt something tighten in my chest. My father used to tell me another lesson when I was young. He would say, "Pay attention to the people who don't complain. Those are the ones carrying the heaviest weight." Mr. Mercer wasn't complaining. He wasn't asking for sympathy either. He was simply answering the questions. I glanced again at the citations. 5 tickets for parking overnight. The city rules were clear. The fines were legal. But laws written on paper don't always show the whole story. "Mr. Mercer," I said gently, "have you been able to access any assistance programs, housing services, veterans support?" At the word veterans, he gave a small nod. "I served a long time ago," he said. The room seemed to lean a little closer. "Benefits got delayed when my address changed," he continued. "Paperwork got sent to the old apartment." His hands tightened slightly on the podium. "When you don't have an address, things get complicated." He wasn't bitter when he said it, just tired. I studied the man standing in front of me. The worn jacket, the empty pockets, the steady voice that refused to beg. After 40 years listening to people explain their mistakes, I've learned something important. Sometimes the real story isn't written in the file. It's hidden in the silence between sentences. And something told me that Mr. Mercer's story hadn't been fully told yet. So I asked him the question that would change the entire direction of that morning. I leaned forward slightly and spoke in a quieter voice. Mr. Mercer, tell me something honestly. He looked up. Who are you still trying to pay back? For a moment, Mr. Mercer didn't answer. His fingers tightened around the edge of the podium, the wood creaking slightly under the pressure. I could see the question had reached somewhere deeper than the parking tickets in front of me. After so many years on the bench, I've learned that certain questions unlock doors people try very hard to keep closed. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before. The hospital, Your Honor. The room went still. I leaned forward slightly. What hospital? He took a breath, the kind a person takes when they know the next words will hurt to say out loud. St. Catherine's, he replied. My wife was treated there. A soft murmur moved through the gallery. He kept his eyes on the podium as he continued. Her name was Maria. She got sick about 3 years ago. His voice didn't crack, but it carried the weight of someone who had told this story too many times. The doctors said it was aggressive cancer. The regular treatments didn't work. They offered something experimental, something that might give her more time. He paused for a moment. My father used to tell me that love shows itself most clearly when things are falling apart. You see what people are willing to sacrifice. Mr. Mercer continued speaking. The insurance company wouldn't cover it, he said it wasn't guaranteed. I already knew where the story was going, but I let him finish. So, I paid for it myself. How? I asked. He shrugged slightly. Sold the house first, then the truck, then whatever savings we had left. The courtroom had become so quiet you could hear someone breathing in the back row. He looked up briefly, meeting my eyes. I wasn't trying to beat the disease, he said, just trying to buy her a little more time. There was something deeply honest about the way he said it. Not dramatic, not self-pitying, just the truth. How much time did you get? I asked. He gave a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. 7 months. That answer hung in the air like a bell that had just been struck. 7 months. Not years. Not even a full year. Just 7 months of borrowed time purchased with everything the man owned. She passed away last winter, he said quietly. But those months mattered. Someone in the gallery sniffed softly, trying not to cry. I looked down again at the stack of citations in front of me, 5 parking tickets, fees and penalties carefully printed by the city's system. On paper, the law was simple. The vehicle had been parked in a restricted lot. Repeatedly, the fines were valid, but the story behind those tickets had nothing to do with carelessness. It had everything to do with loss. I thought again about my father's words. The law should protect people who are already hurting, not make their fall worse. I picked up the citations slowly and looked back at Mr. Mercer. Mr. Mercer, I said. Yes, Your Honor. You stood by your wife through the hardest fight of her life. He nodded once. You gave everything you had to keep that promise. Another quiet nod. Then I did something I don't often do in a courtroom. I tore the first ticket in half. The sound of the paper ripping echoed through the room. Then the second, then the third, then the fourth, and finally the last one. When I set the torn pieces on the bench, the courtroom remained completely silent. Those charges are dismissed, I said. You owe this city nothing. For a moment, Mr. Mercer didn't move. He simply stared at the bench as if he wasn't sure he had heard correctly. Then his shoulders lowered slightly, the tension leaving his body. Thank you, he whispered. But something happened next that I didn't expect. I reached into my robe pocket and pulled out my wallet. Inside were a few bills I had set aside for lunch that afternoon. I placed them on the edge of the bench. This isn't charity, I told him. This is respect. The room remained still for half a second. Then a chair scraped against the floor. A young man in the back row walked forward and placed $20 beside mine. Another person stood, then another. Within moments, people from all over the gallery stepped forward, lawyers, police officers, even a couple waiting for their own cases. Bills and small amounts of cash began forming a small pile on the bench. Mr. Mercer looked down at it, completely stunned. His hands trembled slightly as he gathered the money. "I don't know how to thank you," he said quietly. I nodded toward the door. "Use it to get somewhere warm tonight," I said. The bailiff gently guided him toward the exit, and before he left, Mr. Mercer turned back and gave the room a respectful nod. I thought the emotional moment had ended, but as the courtroom settled again, I heard something that immediately changed the mood. A slow, sarcastic clap. I looked up toward the gallery, and that's when I noticed the man in the expensive suit sitting in the second row, shaking his head with a smirk on his face. The clapping wasn't loud, but in the silence of the courtroom it sounded sharp, almost mocking. Everyone turned toward the man in the second row. He sat there in a perfectly tailored navy suit, one leg crossed over the other, his polished shoe bouncing impatiently. A gold watch gleamed under the courtroom lights each time his wrist moved. The expression on his face wasn't sympathy, it was annoyance. He stopped clapping and leaned back against the wooden bench like someone who had just watched an inconvenience rather than a moment of humanity. I didn't say anything at first. After decades in courtrooms, I've learned that arrogance often reveals itself if you simply give it enough time. The next few cases moved forward, but I kept noticing him. He checked his phone repeatedly, sighed loudly when someone took longer than expected to explain their situation, and once even rolled his eyes when a young college student nervously tried to describe why his brake light had been broken. Some people walk into a courtroom understanding the weight of the place. Others treat it like a waiting room at the airport. Around 20 minutes later, Emily called the next case. Michael Langford. The man in the expensive suit stood immediately. He didn't rush. Instead, he walked forward with slow confidence, adjusting the cuffs of his jacket, like someone entering a boardroom meeting rather than a court of law. He reached the podium and placed a thick leather wallet down on the wood with a firm thud. "Let's make this quick," he said before I had even spoken. "I've got a flight this afternoon." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. I folded my hands calmly on the bench. "Good morning to you as well, Mr. Langford," I replied. He gave a short nod but didn't bother hiding his impatience. I looked down at the citation. "Mr. Langford," I said slowly, "you are charged with parking your vehicle in a restricted emergency access zone outside Northside Children's Hospital." He shrugged. "There wasn't an ambulance there," he replied casually. "I was inside the building for maybe 15 minutes. That zone exists, so ambulances can reach critically ill children without delay," I said. He waved his hand dismissively. "Yes, I understand the sign. I just needed to grab some paperwork." He tapped the leather wallet. "So what's the fine? 200? 500? I'll take care of it now." The way he said it made the courtroom stir uncomfortably, like paying money was the only thing that mattered. I removed my glasses and looked directly at him. "This courtroom isn't a drive-through window, Mr. Langford," I said. He exhaled slowly, clearly annoyed now. "With all due respect, Your Honor, I pay enough taxes in this city to cover whatever parking mistake you think I made." A few people in the gallery gasped quietly. My father used to say something that echoed in my mind right then. "Character is what you show when you think rules don't apply to you." I leaned slightly closer to the microphone. "Every person who stands at that podium is treated the same way," I said calmly. Mr. Langford crossed his arms. "I doubt that." The room felt tense, but before I could continue, something unusual happened. The heavy doors at the back of the courtroom opened. A man in a gray suit walked inside. He moved with the calm authority of someone used to serious situations. Two uniformed federal marshals followed behind him, quietly positioning themselves near the exits. The low murmur of the gallery stopped instantly. The man approached the clerk's desk. "Your Honor," he said respectfully, May I approach? I nodded. Emily accepted a sealed envelope from him and passed it up to the bench. The man spoke again. My name is Special Agent Thomas Rivera with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The words rippled through the room. I opened the envelope. Inside were several official documents. The first page alone made the situation instantly clear. I looked up slowly. Mr. Langford's confident expression had begun to fade. Agent Rivera, I said, keeping my voice steady, would you explain the reason for your presence here today? The agent nodded. For the past 16 months, our office has been investigating Mr. Langford and his investment firm. Mr. Langford's hands gripped the edge of the podium. This is ridiculous, he muttered. Agent Rivera continued. We have evidence that millions of dollars were illegally diverted from the charitable foundation that supports Northside Children's Hospital. A wave of shocked whispers moved through the gallery. That foundation, the agent added, pays for treatments for families who cannot afford them. My chest tightened. I thought about the man who had stood in that exact spot earlier, the man who sold everything he owned to buy his wife 7 more months of life. Mr. Langford's face had gone pale. This is a misunderstanding, he said quickly. But Agent Rivera stepped forward. Michael Langford, he said clearly, you are under arrest for financial fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. The marshals moved in. Metal handcuffs clicked around his wrists. The confident businessman who had walked to the podium minutes earlier now looked like someone who had suddenly lost all control of his world. And the entire courtroom watched in stunned silence as justice finally caught up with him. The sound of the handcuffs clicking shut echoed longer than you might expect. It wasn't loud, but in that moment it carried through every corner of the courtroom. Conversations stopped. Even the officers standing along the wall seemed to hold still for a second. Mr. Langford's shoulders dropped as the reality of the situation settled over him. Just minutes earlier, he had been leaning casually against the podium, confident that money could smooth over whatever mistake he had made. Now he stood there pale and silent while the federal marshals guided his hands behind his back. Sir, you'll need to come with us, one of them said firmly. He didn't argue. The swagger that had followed him down the aisle earlier was gone. When he turned toward the courtroom doors, he stumbled slightly, the polished shoes that had tapped impatiently on the bench now scraping awkwardly against the tile floor. People in the gallery shifted quietly as he passed. No one spoke. The same room that had watched an old man walk out with help and dignity now watched a wealthy businessman leave in handcuffs. The contrast couldn't have been clearer. The heavy doors closed behind them with a deep wooden thud. For a few seconds, the courtroom stayed completely silent. I sat back in my chair and let out a slow breath. My father used to say something else when I was growing up. Justice doesn't always arrive when you expect it, he would tell me. But when it finally does, it tends to be very clear. Looking at the empty podium in front of me, I thought about the 2 men who had stood there that morning. One had walked in with nothing, no money, no home, barely even a place to sleep. But he carried something far more valuable, honor. The other had walked in wearing expensive clothes and carrying the confidence of someone used to getting his way. But the moment the truth surfaced, everything he thought protected him disappeared. I adjourned the courtroom for a short recess after the marshals left. People slowly began standing and stretching their legs, whispering to each other about what they had just witnessed. Even Emily looked over at me with raised eyebrows. That was unexpected, she said quietly. I gave a small nod. Some mornings remind you why this job matters, I replied. Later that afternoon, after the courtroom had emptied and the building had grown quiet again, I sat alone in my chambers reviewing the day's paperwork. The rain that had started earlier had returned, tapping softly against the courthouse windows. The smell of old paper and polished wood filled the room. That's when I received a call from Agent Rivera. He explained that their investigation had uncovered millions of dollars hidden through several shell companies connected to Mr. Langford's firm. Those funds had originally been meant for the hospital's patient assistance program, the very program that helped families afford treatments they otherwise couldn't pay for, the same kind of treatment Mr. Mercer had struggled to provide for his wife. But the story didn't end there. Because of the arrest that morning, those accounts had already been frozen. Within weeks, the recovered money would be returned to the hospital foundation. Dozens of families would receive the help they needed. Treatments would continue. Lives would be changed. When I hung up the phone, I sat quietly for a moment. In this job, you see many difficult things. Arguments, regret, mistakes. But every now and then, you also see something rare. Balance. That day reminded me that justice isn't just about punishment. Sometimes it's about restoring what was taken, and sometimes it's about reminding people that character still matters more than wealth. Before leaving the courthouse that evening, I walked down the empty hallway past the courtroom one more time. The lights were dim now and the benches were empty, but I could still picture the moment from earlier that morning. A tired man standing at the podium with empty pockets, a courtroom full of strangers stepping forward to help him, and another man discovering that power doesn't place anyone above the law. So let me ask you something. If you had been sitting in that courtroom that day, watching those two men stand before the bench, what would you have thought? Do you believe justice was served? Tell me in the comments. I truly do read them. And if stories like this remind you that integrity still matters in this world, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story from this courtroom. Because after all these years on the bench, one thing remains absolutely true. Respect costs nothing, but the absence of it can cost everything.